principles of anatomy and physiology. So the purpose of this chapter is to introduce the disciplines of A&P, discuss the organization of the human body, reveal shared properties of all living things, and discuss the concept of homeostasis. The first thing we do is we define what anatomy and physiology is. And anatomy is the study of the structure, whereas physiology is the study of the function. And then you can see there the selected branches of A&P. So this table, I think it goes on for a few slides, so we'll just kind of scroll through this. But you can see the developmental biology, and then it talks about what that studies, or what it focuses on, I should say. Still on that, systemic anatomy and what it focuses on. So you can kind of go through here and you can get an idea of all the different branches of anatomy. And if you're aspiring to be a nurse or a physician, or a research scientist, then maybe one of these applies to you more than, or maybe you can find one that you're more interested in than others. So let's talk about the levels of structural organization and body systems. So you've probably seen something similar to this in your lower level biology courses, but we can always break things down to the chemical level. And then you can see with those atoms, those elements, we can build molecules from those. And we see the DNA molecule there. And then, of course, that leads us into the cellular level. When we start combining cells, we start to develop tissues. Once we get tissues, we develop the tissues into organs. And then you can kind of see that the organ system, we get to the systemic level, and you can kind of see the whole digestive system there on that model. And the next model just shows you kind of the organismal level. So what you should know then is that there's 11 systems of the human body, and they're listed for you there: integumentary, skeletal, muscular, nervous, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, immune, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive. And if I turn to page 4 in my book, kind of there along the bottom there, table 1.2, it goes on for a few pages, but it kind of goes through all of the different functions and structure of the various systems, and that goes on until page 7. So you need to become familiar with all of those systems, read those parts in your book. Let me just say this now while it's on my mind, but PowerPoint is just, it's an outline. It's not details. It gives you a little bit of detail, but the book gives you the detail that you need. So study the PowerPoint with the book. You can print the PowerPoint. You can make notes on it from your book, but by no means rely only on the PowerPoint. Make sure you're reading the book too. This is just exactly what I was just talking about, the 11 systems of the human body. PowerPoint goes through those, and it goes through those in your book. So this is table 1.2 that I was telling you about. And you can see there the integumentary system, which is your hair, skin, and fingernails. Skeletal system, which is your bones and joints. Muscular system and the nervous system. So we've got skeletal muscle and tendons. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, those also fall into the muscular system. The nervous system includes the brain and the spine. And then, of course, you've got a network of nerves that go out through your whole body. Nervous system is what helps you to perceive the world. You can sense things, you can feel things. That's what takes the signal to your brain and allows you to react. So the nervous system, well, all your systems are very important. Endocrine and cardiovascular system. So the endocrine deals with your hormones, and you can see there on the left. Oh, the other thing I didn't point out was that chapter 18, so it also tells you if you wanted to study up on a particular system a little bit, or what chapter the system's talked about in more detail. And then you can see there that cardiovascular system includes the heart, arteries, and blood vessels. The lymphatic system and the respiratory system. You can see there the lymph deals with immunity. So what happens with lymph is that it will filter out your blood plasma, which is basically your white blood cells, and it helps to clean those. and then it filters them back into the blood once they're cleaned. So it's very important to your immunity. Then the respiratory system. The respiratory system is very important as well. All of your systems are important, of course, but I like to put it this way about the respiratory system is that I could go a week without eating. If I really wanted to fast, if I had a reason to fast, I could probably go a week. I got a few pounds. I might be able to go a week and a few days. And I'd probably go quite a while without eating before it really did some serious damage to me. Water, on the other hand, have a drink now. You'd be lucky to go a couple days without water. I mean, probably be lucky to go a day without water. But the respiratory system, unless you're a swimmer, you know, if you swim, you probably got some pretty good tidal capacity there in your lungs. You might be able to go several minutes underwater without and doing physical motion. However, most people can't go very long without oxygen, so respiratory, very important. Digestive and urinary. The digestive system we see there, it starts with the mouth and it ends with the anus. And it basically, that's how we consume food that gives us energy. And then, of course, the urinary system is kind of a filter system that helps filter out wastes out of our body. That involves the kidneys, the urinary bladder, and, of course, the urethra. The urinary system is, I'm going to go back to the respiratory system and the urinary system are very closely related. And that's another thing that we'll be talking about in this class is, like I showed you on that first diagram on figure 1.1 on page 3 of your textbook. You know, when you get to the organismal level, all of your systems are functioning together. Some of them function very closely together, such as the urinary system and the respiratory system. And we'll talk about that as the course goes on. Reproductive system. Well, the reproductive system I always thought was interesting because a couple different reasons here. First of all, it is the one system that you can actually live without. All right, so you would find life very difficult if you didn't have your cardiovascular system or your respiratory system or your lymphatic system. All of those systems you really need to be able to maintain your homeostasis. However, if you do not have reproductive organs or you don't have reproductive capability, you can still go on to live a fully normal life. So that's one thing that I thought was interesting about this system. And then the other thing I thought's interesting is, you can see it there on the screen, is that it's divided into male and female. So there's two different sexes and we both have different parts of our anatomy that allow us to be sexually reproducing organisms. So what that means is that it takes a man and a woman to create an offspring. And that's partially due to the fact that reproductive organs of the male and female are opposites. And you should know this from early biology, but you know, with meiosis, your cells are split in half, and your reproductive cells, your eggs or your sperm, have half the amount of DNA as your somatic cells. So, and I make the argument all the time that I believe that's part of the reason why that, you know, it takes that to create, because you have that, only having half of the DNA in those cells gives you that drive to where you want to reproduce. So it's a very interesting system. We have the characteristics of the living human organism. Basic life processes. All living things have certain characteristics that distinguish them from non-living things. This was really basic biology, right? There's 7 characteristics that are required for something to be considered alive. Life processes in humans include metabolism, responsiveness, movement, growth, differentiation, and reproduction. Is that 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What are they missing? According to Biology 100, they're missing homeostasis. But so you can see there that we have some processes that differentiate a human or a dog from a rock. And as I said, homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is going to be a recurring theme this semester, so you need to become very familiar with this word and what it means. Stasis basically means the same, static. In other words, something stays in a condition of equilibrium. Not different, it's the same. If it's homogeneous, it's the same. So homeo is the same, static. It stays in a condition of equilibrium. For instance, when you sweat, that's your body maintaining homeostasis. No, that's a great example because it says in the body's internal environment. So when your internal environment starts to heat up, one of the ways that your body cools off is by producing sweat. And then there's a number of regulatory processes that are helping the body to maintain its homeostasis. So let's talk quickly about body fluids and homeostasis. And this figure here is figure 1.2 in your textbook on page 10. So the survival of our body cell is dependent on the precise regulation of chemical composition of the surrounding fluid. It shows it there. It's kind of like basic biology where we talked about osmosis, how things can diffuse in and out, across a selectively permeable membrane. You see that in action right there in that figure on the side. So the extracellular fluid needs to maintain some sort of homeostasis shows the example of the blood vessels. And this is just a very broken down drawing of your systems here. You see the digestive system and then the integumentary system, so it's just equated the human body to a square is basically what it's doing. And then you can see how all of this oxygen diffuses in and out. Carbon dioxide makes its way around the circulatory system. Some of it is filtered out into the urinary system. And then, of course, the digestive system provides the nutrients, which diffuse into the blood system that's delivered to all the cells. The wastes go back into the circulatory system and either find their way to the kidneys or to the lungs. For example, carbon dioxide is a waste that's diffused back into the lungs, and when you exhale, you're exhaling carbon dioxide. Control of homeostasis. Homeostatic imbalances occur because of disruption from the external or internal environments. Interactions, you can click on these links and then you can see this animation that shows the internal and external environments. So here's the basic components of a feedback loop. So the feedback loop is very important to homeostasis, and there's two kinds of feedback loops. There's the negative feedback loop and the positive feedback loop. But this particular slide is just showing you a broad overview, kind of like that previous slide we saw where it just shows the broad overview of the human organism here, and basically equated to a square. And if you wanted to study more on this figure, it's figure 1.3 on page 11 of your book. So you can see that you have some stimulus that disrupts the homeostasis. And then in a controlled condition, this is monitored by receptors in your body. Like that might be something that's connected to the nervous system that's going to send a nerve impulse. And then the control center, for instance, the control center would probably be the brain, which would send a response out and output. And then the effectors are the things that bring about the change. That creates a response that alters any controlled condition. And then it loops back around to homeostasis. So that's really just a feedback loop, really basic, generic version of a feedback loop. But let's look a little closer at feedback loops. As I said, negative feedback loop. So you can actually liken a negative feedback loop to a furnace in your house, right? That's basically what it is. And it shows this in detail at figure 1.4 on page 12. But your book uses the example of blood pressure. Well, it's winter out, so it's probably pretty cold where you're at. It's very cold where I'm at. And I can hear my furnace running right now. So I'm going to kind of go through this example about a furnace, right? Because the furnace is really your heating system at your house is really just a negative feedback loop. You have a thermostat control center that has a sensor on it, and when that external environment becomes colder than what the thermostat says, it says, well, hey, we need to kick this on, and we need to heat up the place. So then your furnace kicks on, and then once it gets warmer and you get more signals back to the control center, then that kicks off. But the stimulus, in the example of blood pressure on figure 1.4, disrupts homeostasis by increasing the controlled condition of blood pressure. Then that goes to receptors. The baroreceptors in certain blood vessels input to the nerve impulses, which go to the control center brain. And that outputs other nerve impulses, and it gets to the effectors, the heart and the blood vessels. And then the response is a decrease in heart rate and the dilation or widening of blood vessels, and that causes the blood pressure to decrease. And then once that decrease happens, it returns to homeostasis. So your blood pressure gets normal again. So this is an important concept to understand, class, that as a result of aging oftentimes, and things like your diet can affect this, your lifestyle, your environment, they can affect your blood pressure. And then over time, your body starts to have difficulty maintaining this homeostasis. When you're young, it's easy. But as you age, that starts to become more and more difficult for it. So if you're a young person and you're smoking and doing all of that stuff that you probably know you shouldn't be doing, that's why people who spend their life smoking have blood pressure, among other problems, when they get to be older, because their body starts to lose that ability to maintain that homeostasis. And then what happens? They go to the doctor, and the doctor is going to prescribe them a bunch of pills, and they become part of the system there. It's no secret that the pharmacy industry is huge. I mean, they make a lot of money selling drugs. So I guess I am the kind of person, I advocate for working on a healthier lifestyle. And believe me, I'm by no means perfect, but if you're young enough and you can affect changes in the long run, that's something you should really think about now. And if you are studying to be a nurse or a doctor or a research scientist, something that you should also tell your patients or your colleagues to live a healthier lifestyle. And then hopefully what happens in that case, your homeostasis mechanisms, they will last longer. But we also have another type of homeostasis, and that's positive feedback. So what is positive feedback? Well, your book uses the example of the child being born, or the baby being born. This is at 1.5 on page 12 in your textbook, but you can see the contractions of the wall of the uterus force the baby's head or body into the cervix. So this is a controlled condition where the cervix starts to stretch. There's receptors in the cervix that will send nerve impulses. It sends the input to the brain, the control center, and then that brain is going to output the idea. It's going to tell the body to release this hormone, oxytocin. And when that happens, the effectors are the muscles in the wall of the uterus, but they're going to contract more forcefully, and thereby baby's going to be pushed, and the cervix stretches even more. And then there's an interruption in the cycle by the birth of the baby, and that decreases the stretching of the cervix, and that breaks the positive loop there. And then it goes back to where the cervix causes the release of more oxytocin, which results in more stretching of the cervix. So that's kind of the idea of the positive feedback loop. There was something important here in the book. So let's think about it this way. And I'm reading from page 11 down at the bottom under positive feedback system. So unlike a negative feedback system, which I think the negative feedback system is a little more straightforward, because remember, when it boils down to it, what you need to do, if you get confused on it, just think about how your thermostat works, because everybody, I hope everybody has a heater in their house and it's working right now because it's so cold. Or even in the summer, your air conditioning works kind of the same way. That's an example of negative feedback. So it's kind of easier to understand. But this positive feedback system, I think, is a little more abstract. So unlike a negative feedback system, a positive feedback system tends to strengthen or reinforce change. So that's what it's doing when it releases that hormone oxytocin. It's really enhancing that stretching of the cervix. It wants it to do more. It wants those muscles to contract more. All right, so it enhances the response. Whereas with the negative feedback, what it's doing is the effectors are working to control the risk, to stop it, to get back to where it is 72 degrees, however warm you keep it in your house. Or in the case of blood pressure, whatever normal blood pressure is. So your body works the negative feedback like that, but the positive feedback, it actually helps it. It wants it to be more pronounced. The birth of a baby is a great example for that, because in order to get the baby out, you need more and more positive feedback to that. You gotta keep pushing on that and keep widening that. So very good read there on these feedback systems in this book on page 11. Homeostatic imbalances. So I was just talking about this a few minutes ago. When homeostasis is disrupted, it may result in disease, disorder, or even death. Factors such as your genetic makeup, the air you breathe, the food you eat, and the thoughts you think can all affect your health. Now, this is another very important takeaway from this chapter, is the terminology of anatomy. So what we need to become familiar with, in addition to the negative and positive feedback loops and the systems of the body, is also basic anatomy terminology that we will use throughout this course, throughout A&P2. If you're going on to be a nurse or a physician or even a research scientist, you're going to be using these terms your whole life. And I'll tell you another thing that it doesn't mention in your book, and that's that you learn these terms, you become familiar with them, you learn how to use them. You can go to the doctor and you can have that conversation with your doctor, because your doctor will understand these kind of anatomical terms that you're talking about, and you'll be able to have a better conversation. So it's a win-win to learn this stuff. Body positions, regional names, directional terms, planes and sections, and body cavities. That's what we're talking about next. So the anatomical body position, you can see there on figure 1.6 at page 15. Body stands erect, feet are facing forward, palms are up, and that's what we call anatomical position. So you need to be looking at your book right now. The book, figure 1.6, shows all of the different parts of the body there, but really right now we're just interested in the positioning of the body. If we're looking at the book and you're looking at figure 1.6, on the left there, view A, when the body is facing upward, we're seeing the anterior view. But if the body is lying face upward, we call that supine. Okay, and then on letter B there, the posterior view. So posterior means rear, back, post. If you have dinner tonight after this lecture, you're having dinner post lecture. Okay, and then of course anterior means front, post means back, posterior. And so I'm just saying this because if you were in an autopsy or something, you got the body in anatomical position and it's lying face down, we call that prone. Has anybody ever taken swim lessons? You know, one of the first things they teach you is the prone glide. They teach you how to float face down in the water and how to move that way. It's called the prone glide. So just know this: prone is body laying down, supine is body lying face up. And then you can see the regional names there. You can see the bold face is talking about the regions here. You see they're kind of in brackets. And you can see that in your textbook as well. So we also use what we call directional terms. Page 17, figure 1.7. So we can see there that we have this midline. So if we drew a center line right down the body in anatomical position, we would call that the midline. That position there is medial. All right, and anything to the side of this line is what we call lateral. So if you think about it this way, your ears are lateral to your nose. Okay. Superior and inferior. What superior means is higher, inferior means lower. So your ears are superior to your heart, and your pelvis is inferior to your heart. Now, that doesn't mean that your pelvis or your heart or your ears are any less important than one another. This is just for positioning purposes. Okay. And then, of course, we have the other one that's proximal and distal. And usually this relates to the center of the body. So, like the fingers are distal to the shoulder. The shoulder is lateral to the heart. Okay, so you can see there, you can draw any line here and you can have a term. So, you know, if you hear somebody say this is lateral, if we're talking in anatomical terms this semester, we talk about something lateral, you know it's to one side of the midline or the other. Exhibit 1 on page 16. So you kind of see the definitions of all those there. So you're going to be responsible for reading through these and learning those. Planes and sections. This is like algebra, right? Because you've got kind of like a coordinate plane there. So you can divide the body up into these different planes and section it off that way. And there's a nice diagram of that there, and that diagram is actually figure 1.8 on page 18. So here we use the brain to visualize these sections, but you see the median plane there slices the brain directly in half. The coronal plane slices it in half, but through another way. And it might not even be half, be like towards the center. It may not be even halves. The halves are going to look different, but you can see the coronal section there looks quite a bit different from the median section. And then, of course, the transverse is like cutting it through the top there. And all of those sections look very different. And you can see that on page 18 on figure 1.9. And now it talks about body cavities. This is figure 1.10 and 1.11 on page 19. But we can see that there are 3 major cavities to the body. Now there's some subcavities that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but the cranial cavity, the vertebral cavity, thoracic, and the abdominal pelvic cavity. And all of those house different organs, and they have different purposes. And this figure 111 here talks about all those and how they're divided up into these subcavities. So study that in your book. And then serous membranes. So these are thin double-layered membranes that cover the viscera within the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and also line the walls of the thorax and the abdomen. The visceral layer and the parietal layer. And the serous membranes reduce friction. So here's the serous membranes in the thoracic cavity. Remember the thoracic cavity? That's this one here where your lungs and your heart are. So you've got this serous membrane, and it's lining your heart and it's lining your lungs. So you can see it's divided into what we call the pleura for the lungs, and for the heart it's called the pericardium. But it's basically the same type of membrane. It just has different words for each specific organ. So here's a transverse section. So you can see that the model towards the upper left, you can see how we were just talking about these sections or these planes. Now we've sliced transversely, and now we're looking down into the thoracic cavity. And then you can see the different parts there and their respective membranes. See the membrane outlining the lung here, and there's this darker red here going around the heart. And this is also page 20 of your book. Serous membranes of the abdominal cavity. The peritoneum covers many of the abdominal organs. The retroperitoneal is a classification of some organs because they are not surrounded by the peritoneum. Rather, they are posterior to it. That means that when we say something's retroperitoneal, that means it's actually towards the rear. It's posterior to the organs that are covered by the peritoneum. And it shows you that here at 112 on page 21, a little bit. Yeah, and now I'm lecturing from page 22. And you can see the abdominal cavity can be divided into regions or quadrants to easily describe the location of organs. So basically, it divides the abdominal cavity into 9 regions. There you have a couple different quadrants there, or excuse me, 4 different, not a couple, you got 4 different quadrants there because quad is 4. But this shows you all of their names and then the organs that they house. So I was already talking about aging and homeostasis, but aging is a normal process characterized by a progressive decline in the body's ability to restore homeostasis. It's going to impact all body systems. It produces structural and functional changes, and it increases vulnerability to stress and disease. So now we're talking about medical imaging, and you can see this at table 1.3 on page 23. So medical imaging is important because with today's technology, we're able to actually visualize the internal environment of our body relatively easy. A lot easier than it was several centuries ago, that's for sure. But it allows physicians to look in there and to identify if there's something wrong or something right. This allows physicians to diagnose anatomical and physiological abnormalities. Then just goes through all the different types of medical imaging procedures. So radiography, it talks about that. You use the X-ray. Everybody's probably had an X-ray. MRI and CT scan. Magnetic resonance imaging and computed tomography. It says that MRIs are relatively safe but cannot be used on patients with metal in their bodies. The CT visualizes soft tissues and organs with much more detail than conventional radiographs. And there's a couple examples of those. Ultrasound is where you use sound waves to go into the body and then to reflect back to it has a source, and then it'll also have something that can collect it. So whatever is reflected off of the whatever's in the body, in this case they're showing a baby, and this is very popular for pregnant people who have their ultrasound done so they can see, kind of see if their baby's developing normally. You can tell the sex of the baby this way. There's a lot of advantages to it, and it's very safe. Computed tomography, angiography, a CCTA scan, and then the PET scan, the positron emission. More comments on those, and then you can kind of see, wow, look at that. And then look at the one on the right. So you get some pretty detailed images there of parts of the body. Endoscopy, this is where you'll put camera down your throat or in your anus, and you can go in there and you can kind of look your way around and see if there's any problems that way. Radionuclide scanning.